So I had been very proud of being able to come here on the metro, but then I went to the yellow line and they said the station was closed and they put us on the street, and I waited for an Uber and everybody else's Uber stopped on the side, like in the middle of the street. My Uber driver disappeared and I waited for a second one, and the good thing was he was learning English, so we had a good conversation. So, except I'm late. Cancel. Okay, so back to our theme. Oh, okay. That's your problem. All right. So just to remind you, I'm going through the first few slides because we are now on to a new topic. So we talked about nonlinearity, right? For 2 lectures, we have a fairly good handle, hopefully, on that now. In your notes to refer back to if you wanted to go back. And we know that it arises when biotic interactions generate these density or frequency dependence in fitness. And we've seen this. Fitness is the per capita growth rate. We've been dealing a lot with the per capita growth rate, right? So we know this. Now, variability is an interesting concept because abiotic variation cannot generate density or frequency dependence in fitness. That has to happen through the feedbacks that can only arise through biotic interactions, species interactions. So we say in a sort of a dynamical systems theory point of view that abiotic variation is outside the feedback structure of your biological system. But the important, so this is what I was always saying, just because the environment is heterogeneous does not mean it actually makes a difference to species interactions. But they see, while they cannot generate density or frequency dependence, they can modify these nonlinearities in time or space that then can lead to the kind of large scale patterns we see in nature, right? Because we see that some species are abundant in some locations, not in others. We see the latitudinal gradient in diversity, which people have been trying to explain for the last 200 years. So we have a Cope's rule, like how body size changes with latitude, body size changes with other things. So you have these sort of patterns, and they, the way they change over time or space, or in the fossil record, we see like horses were really small, then they became the things we know as horses now. So these arise because variability can modify this nonlinearity. So what we really want to get a very good understanding is how exactly does that occur? Okay? Just because the environment, the rainfall changes doesn't mean it actually has a difference, makes a difference to these nonlinear dynamics. Okay? So we are going to then look at this interplay. Of course, then looking at variability means you do have to look at nonlinearity and the interplay, right? So you already understand what nonlinearity does in the absence of any variation. So we have the bottom line, right? We learned that in these past 2 lectures. Now we ask, what is the interplay? When variability is a factor in the system, how does it alter the nonlinear dynamics outcomes that we see in the absence of variation? Okay? And there are 2 dimensions to this, spatial and temporal, and today I'm going to talk about the interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation. So the minute we talk about space, we think about scale. So there are 2 scales that we really sort of focus on. One is the local scale, what we call the local scales. That's where local dynamics, all the nonlinearities we talked about, they operate on that local scale. So you have a community, say, of interacting species. You have species interactions, you have the R star, P star rules, you have relative nonlinearity. All that occurs on that local scale, and that's what we've been studying, right? We've been studying that for actually now 2 days. But then we want to expand our worldview now to larger scales. And generally the scale we are interested in is typically called the regional scale. So now think about this transition from the local to the regional. There is variability now because not all communities in space are going to be the same, right? There is, in this transition, variability, and that variability leads to this interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation. This is what Peter Chesson calls the scale transition. So when you go at the local scale, you just have nonlinear dynamics, right? But then with variability, you get this interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation that leads to something, a different outcome at this scale. That is the scale transition. And that's a much more sort of a deeper concept, but that's the idea. But so you see with that transition, you come to the regional scale. Now instead of just a community of interacting species, you can have a meta-community of interacting communities. How do these communities interact? They interact through dispersal. So that's a biotic process that connects the two scales. This is the abiotic process that connects the two scales, right? So, and you have in the absence of dispersal, you have the local nonlinear, this interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation that leads to the scale transition. Dispersal then can modify the nature of that transition through the movement of individuals between these communities, okay? So that's, everybody happy with that sort of the picture? So that's where we start, that's where we, yes?
Hi, good morning. You said dispersal as a biotic factor. You mean only movement of the individuals themselves? That's dispersal?
Here we're talking about, when you say dispersal, we talk about live organisms. You could have flows, energy flows and things like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the movement of individuals between different locations. Okay? So it could be microbes, it could even be pollen, but they're biotic entities.
It's movement of individuals.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the movement of water flow like hydrology. Very, very good point. Yeah, this is, the word dispersal generally connotes biotic. Okay? That's a good question to ask because I've been using that word for so long that, very good point. Okay. Feel free, just to ask questions. So, okay, so let's just launch to this. So again, now you're an expert in this. We have density-dependent feedback loops generated by species interactions within local communities. We went through a lot of species interactions, like even intergroup predation. So we know all that stuff now. So this thing about spatial variation, so this is the thing that I have been harping on from the beginning. The environment is heterogeneous, right? We are here, we go a few miles from here, it's different, right? Sometimes the rain is very local. Somebody took me driving to a different place on Sunday. It was really nice and bright. We came back to Sao Paulo and it was raining really, really hard. So, but it was only a few miles. So the environment is heterogeneous. But what is important for coexistence, diversity, species interactions is there should be spatial heterogeneity in the biotic environment. The nature of these interactions, what other species create, the environment the other species create. So like for example, if you're competing for the same resource, your environment is other competitors, right? Including your own species, individuals of your own species. So it's a very, very important thing because a lot of people just confuse heterogeneity with the actual modification of density-dependent processes. And this is what leads to a lot of these issues about a priori assumption, if heterogeneity exists in the environment, that must mean coexistence. And then people are puzzled when you don't find it, right? But you shouldn't find it. You should only find it if there is this actual modification. So what this means is that the spatial variation in the environment, so the abiotic environment, generates spatial variance in these density-dependent feedback loops, okay? What that just in simple words means is the nature of the density frequency dependence is not the same everywhere. In some places it's very strong, in some places it's weak, in some places it's positive, in some places it's negative. You understand, right? So that's clear, right? I mean, it's a very simple idea. So, but it's the density frequency dependence that has to vary spatially. if there's variation in the abiotic environment that does not lead to spatial variation in density dependent feedback, then that variability is irrelevant to diversity, okay? So that's what you have to always, when you read things, keep in mind. Yes? You're close enough actually, so.
Just from the slide before this one, just a terminology, is there anything like, is it, how do I say it? Is there any significant difference that I should know between variation and variance in this context?
So I would say variance is more of a statistical concept where we quantify variability. Okay? That's the most common difference between the two. So you wouldn't, so that's why I say spatial variance in density, because you quantify that actually using the variance. Variability in the environment could be quantified that way, but so that's, I'm just distinguishing between those two. You could say variance also, but the variance generally, when we say variance, we think like an O or something, right? Like you think of statistical, but here actually does mean that, because we can compute the variance in density dependence.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so good. These are all really good questions. So we are going to now, it's good to have an example of this, right? A concrete example, and we are going to our favorite one, which is exploitative competition. But now we are looking at it as spatially varying environment. So what I really care, when I said before spatially heterogeneous biotic environment, right? So in the context of competition, what that means is it's a spatially heterogeneous competitive environment. Not just that rainfall changes everywhere, from place to place, it's that the change in rainfall somehow also changes the competitive environment, right? It's good for species A here, it's better for species B here, something like that, okay? And we'll get to that. But basically what this says is that the spatial environment variation, so like things like that are outside the feedback structure, rainfall, climate change, pollution, habitat destruction, whatever it is, or natural or anthropogenic variation, should create spatial heterogeneity in competitive interactions. All that really means is that the strength of intra and interspecific competition is not the same everywhere. We saw what happens when it is the same, right? R star, P star. There's no coexistence. You have competitive exclusion, directional selection. There's monomorphism. One thing dominates, right? So, but if this is possible, we ask the question, can more than one thing persist together, which is coexistence, right? Okay. So here's a sort of a cartoon to illustrate. So we have a sort of a patchy landscape in which these species inhabit. They could be like, patches of serpentine, they could be patches of host plants, could be a different kind of soil. And here I'm just depicting two localities, locality 1 and locality 2. And the point is, this locality 1 is favorable to species 1, which means it exerts very strong competition on other species, competing for the resource, leading to the exclusion of species 2. So we say that that's a source population for species 1 because it has a surplus of reproduction, right? Because it's doing well, it's just sent the other one extinct. So it can persist on its own even if there's no movement between patches, right? But for species 2, it's a sink because it cannot persist in isolation. Why? R star rule, right? It cannot persist because of the R star rule. The best competitor is going to win. But since now we are expanding our worldview to look at more than one population, one locality, there could be another one somewhere in the landscape where it's not as favorable to species 1, species 2 has the competitive advantage. So then that becomes a sink for species 1 but a source for species 2, right? This is the whole idea of spatial heterogeneity, but see, it has actually changed the competitive rankings, right? It wasn't enough for this thing to differ in soil or something. It actually made the species change, the competitive hierarchy is now changed. It also has to, so the point is that when you look in this spatially heterogeneous competitive environment, what you really get is not local coexistence, right? Within a locality, you have the R-star rule. Only one species can persist. But if you expand to look at, that's the larger scale I talked about. Remember the meta community, you actually have them coexisting on a regional scale, right? You just look at one patch and you say, okay, species 2 is absent, but then you look at a lot of patches and you see that species 2 is in some of those patches, species 1 is on. So on that scale, they are coexisting, right? But they're coexisting, why? Because they're sort of isolated. It's kind of an obvious thing, right? They're not really directly in their faces competing. But on that scale, you could say there is diversity. And often, that's sort of what it is in, if you look at large enough scale. On a large enough scale, everything is coexisting, right? If you look at the planet. Well, minus everything we've done to destroy them. But so we see that just spatial variation in competitive ability alone can lead to regional coexistence. But in some ways, that's sort of obvious, right? Because they're not like interacting really. Things. The really interesting, challenging question is, if you now have dispersal between localities, you have spatial variation in competitive ability and dispersal, can you get local coexistence? Meaning, can they actually coexist within a locality? That's a hard problem. That's what we want to tackle, okay? So like this. Now, species, remember locality 1 is a source for species 1. Basically, it wins there. Locality 2 is a source for species 2. But they could be now moving through emigration. You go out of your patch, that's emigration. You go into a patch, that's immigration. So dispersal can maintain a small sink population of species 2 there and a small sink population of species 1 there. So you can get local coexistence through what is called source-sink dynamics. Now that's easy to say. We have to show that that can happen, right? So that's what we're going to learn, right? So the point is that we can find situations in which dispersal can increase diversity given spatial variation in competitive ability. Okay, but we are going to try to convince ourselves of that. So we are going to look at a scenario where there is a patchy environment. There's spatial variation in competitive ability, and emigration and immigration between patches occur on the same time scale as local dynamics. What's local dynamics? Birth, death, competition, right? Why am I saying that? Because there is another kind of metapopulation, meta-community theory where you don't really look at local dynamics at all. You look at occupancy, right? This is what, like, everybody has heard of the Levin's metapopulation model? Or extinction colonization. Well, I'll do a model like that for a different species interaction, so we'll get exposed to it. But this is where basically everything is happening. So birth, death, emigration, immigration happens on the same time scale. So they can have the same impact on population dynamics, okay? All right. So we're going to start with a 2-patch, 2-species meta-community, which is completely generalizable to N-patch, M-species meta-community, okay? So here is our model of competition and dispersal. Now here we are going back to Lotka-Volterra type of competition, okay? Not the dynamic resource R-star type, simply because I want to start here to show you something really interesting that you can analytically show. So here we have local dynamics. You have the intrinsic growth rate, intraspecific competition, interspecific competition, and the same for species 2. And then you have these additional terms here. Dx minus dxxi is the emigration term of species I, and dxxj is immigration of the other species into that patch, right? So you have local dynamics, you have some individuals leaving that patch and going to the other patch, and then there are individuals coming from the other patch, okay? So here species are X and Y, okay? The IJ are patches, okay? So because I didn't put X, IJ, blah, blah, because it gets really, the notation gets really clunky, but basically you could just write this down. dx1 or dx2 or dx dy, dx1, dy1, dx2, dy2, 2. You get the idea, right? You can just write it out. I'm just condensing it to 2 equations. And the 3 terms that are important is local dynamics driven by intra and interspecific competition, emigration and immigration. Now we threw our favorite thing, which is to non-dimensionalize this model. And you should try this actually with this one. So basically what we do is we scale abundance by carrying capacity. We scale the competition coefficients by the ratio of carrying capacities. Then we have a ratio itself for each of the carrying capacities of the species in the 2 patches. Okay. We have a metric for scaling the growth rates of the 2 species. And this one is really important. Beta x and beta y are each species per capita emigration rate scaled by its growth rate. Why is that important? Because at any then by looking at that, you can tell how high the emigration rate is relative to the growth rate. If it's really high, what can you say about that? The population is actually moving to its detriment, right? Because you're actually, you don't have a surplus, you're actually sending more individuals out than you produce, right? So that's really useful, because if you just, I gave you some number for d of x, you're not going to know. Like I say 0.1, I don't know, what does that mean? But if you know the ratio, right? So if it's really high relative to the growth rate, that means, okay, this patch is heading towards extinction. And then we scale time by, as usual, with species 1's intrinsic growth rate, okay? Now, oops, is that the right one? Yeah. Now we are interested, yeah.
It's actually a question that I wanted to ask yesterday, but I didn't, and you don't have to spend too much time on it. But before yesterday, I've never seen this method of scaling parameters with other parameters. And what is the criteria you use to decide what you're going to scale against what, you know? Because it made sense to scale the emigration with the growth rate. And is it always looking for some biological reasoning behind the scaling?
Yes. So what you do is you first look at the state variables, which are the abundances. And you want to scale them in a way we did, because then it's a ratio, like, you know, it goes to 1, right, as the maximum. And that's useful, right? So a carrying capacity is always useful. That's where you start. So you do that, and then you think about the parameters, and you ask yourself, what would I want good scaling ratios of? And you don't have to do many. In this one, if you did this, then you know you have to divide by Rx all over the place, right? And the others just fall into place. And that's the beauty of it, the way if you choose, and you can do it differently. There are many ways of doing it. Not all, so the carrying capacity thing is universal, because, you know, that's the only way you can scale a state variable. But the parameters can be different groupings. So sometimes I've done it one way for one paper, and then I would think, oh, you know, you can also do it in a different way. It depends on what you're looking for. So here we are really interested in this, right? So that's what I chose. I mean, this is a model I developed. So I chose this way back when you were babies. So yeah, I chose that, but I thought that would be important for me. And you will see that it's actually, but it's a very good point. When you do it, state variables are done, and then depending on how you divide up the state variable, you will end up with something that has units. Then, you know, you kind of manipulate it. You multiply and divide by the same thing, or you do something else, and it works out. But make sure you actually don't have any units in the final thing. So sometimes so that's the thing. And yes.
I'm just trying to understand the logic of the beta. The beta is like the rate of emigrating
per
individuals.
capita, per individual rate of leaving a patch.
Oh, like a probability?
Sorry?
Like
emigration.
A probability?
For
excuse me, can you say that again?
So it's the per individual rate at which individuals leave their resident patch.
Okay.
The emigration. Emigration is when you leave a focal patch, right? So this is the rate per individual rate, like a per capita birth rate. If you go back to the equation, so you have dxx, right? That's the total emigration rate. So then by definition, dx is the per capita, per individual emigration rate, okay? So you have to kind of get used to those ideas, like all of these are, the intrinsic growth rate, those are like per individual things. I think like just play around, maybe we could sit down and do something to help you with that. So basically, if you look at that, what's that? You have something multiplied by the population size, right? That's the total rate, because that still has numbers over time, right? But then what is the rate per individual? Because what you measure is you measure this over a lot of individuals and you average by the number of individuals, right? So that's the per rate. You know, like if you measured something, so you're measuring the attack rate. You measure it over a lot of individuals, right? And then you get the average attack rate, like per individual attack rate, which is dividing by the number of individuals. So it's almost like if you measured in real life that whole quantity, then you divide by the number of individuals you use to measure that with, and you get the per capita emigration rate, okay? All right, so now in this model we are really interested in the interplay between competition and dispersal, right? That's what we're interested in. So what we do is we consider the species to be otherwise similar, but be differing in the key parameters of competition and dispersal. So we are going to set some of these things to 1, set some things equal to other thing. The advantage is we get a fairly sort of a simpler model with some very elegant criteria, okay? So that's the reason. You can always put them back in and ask how sensitive are my findings for that. So now you get something fairly nice, right? So they differ in 2 things. In the alphas, which denote the strength of competition, and in the betas that denote the strength of dispersal, emigration, right? But now it's scaled by the local growth rate, remember? And the alphas are scaled by the carrying capacity. So it's a really nice metric. It's telling you everything about limitation, right? So the only thing is when you put values on these things, on the non-dimensionalized thing, you have to kind of go back and say, what would I do? Like, can I have this thing be bigger than the ratio of the carrying capacity? So like you have to just remember that. But this is really good for analytical work. So this is what physicists and mathematicians use, right? They're not actually worried about the parameters. But it gives you fairly elegant solutions, and then you can go back and look at those parameter metrics and say, ha, that's why this works, or this is important, okay? Right. So now here's our question. Within a given patch, can the inferior competitor increase when rare, when the superior competitor is at carrying capacity? But the difference now is there's dispersal, right? Before we just had competition, but now there's dispersal. Now it's a 4-dimensional system, right? You have 2 species and 2 patches. So we can't just get the per capita growth rate the way you used to for 2 species. So we construct the Jacobian for the competition dispersal model, and it looks something like this. It's not important, the details, but where there are zeros is there when there are no interactions, okay? Now, so, and this is, you can work this out, so I'm just showing this, that's what we end up getting. And then we do, that's just the recipe, we evaluate the Jacobian at the boundary equilibrium where species 1 is present everywhere, species 2 is present nowhere, right? Because now it's not one patch, it's the whole landscape. So the invasibility is now at the regional scale, okay? So of course, we know the inferior competitor can invade when rare if the dominant eigenvalue is positive. And we find that the dominant eigenvalue is positive if that quadratic thing is positive, where B is this thing and C is this thing. Now you see how beautifully we have captured the betas and the alphas here, okay? And this will become clearer when I simplify this. And from that, we get the invasion criterion for the inferior competitor. Now notice some of these quantities. 1 minus alpha y j, meaning 1 or 2, is the initial per capita growth rate of the inferior competitor in patch I in the absence of dispersal. Because without dispersal, look at this simplified model. Without dispersal, you just end up with that term, right? And since it's rare, the x actually falls out. We can ignore the x, so you end up with 1 minus alpha yi, right? But it's to be a per capita growth rate, then when you take the derivative, then you take the derivative with respect to your density, so yi drops out, right? Because these are partial derivatives, okay? So remember that that's the initial per capita growth rate of the, so basically it's the competition, the alpha yi1 is the competition you experience from the dominant species, right? Intra-specific competition is non-existent. Why? The species is really rare, right? What is it experiencing competition from? The other species. The other species is everywhere. You're just few in number. So the competition coefficient simplifies to that. So just remember what that is. Then notice something. So this is what I said about like a really elegant criterion because it means something. Notice the first part. That actually is the product of the initial growth rates in the two patches. And the second part is the sum of the initial growth rates. It's almost a statistical kind of partitioning, right? An additive term and a product term there, right? It's kind of really, really interesting. Just itself, without forgetting anything else. Why would it work out like that? It's really interesting. So, and that is going to actually help us understand this, okay? So as I said, innovation is only possible. I claimed innovation is possible only in a competitively, spatially heterogeneous competitive environment. To prove that this is the case, let's look at what innovation is like in a spatially homogeneous competitive environment. So this is the argument. If there's some variability in the environment, somehow you must be able to coexist, okay? Without it, if you didn't alter the density dependent. So now think about this. In a spatially homogeneous environment, species 1 is the superior competitor everywhere, right? So the competition it experiences from the other species is less than 1. Remember, we scale these things, so the maximum is 1. Species 2, this is the inferior competitor across the landscape. So the competition it experiences from the other species is stronger, right? So here, what this means is this is much bigger than, okay, just think of these like this. A competition coefficient less than 1 means you experience stronger interspecific competition relative to intraspecific competition. Greater than 1 means you experience, less than 1 means you experience stronger intraspecific competition because you are the superior competitor. Superior competitor is always more limited by itself because it exerts a stronger effect on the other species, right? Greater than 1 means interspecific competition is stronger than intraspecific competition. So I haven't gone through the everything because that's an entire manuscript, like a whole paper. So I'm just give you these things. But if you're interested, you can actually go back and work on this model. Okay. So then if you simplify it, we get, so this is our regular innovation criterion. Now we are going to simplify this using these reduced coefficients, and you end up with something like that, okay? Okay, so now here's something about negatives and positives, multiplying, adding negatives and positives that you have to keep track of, okay, and help me out. If people get confused, we can talk about it. So now remember, this is the innovation criterion for the inferior competitor. So its local per capita growth rate is always negative, right? In the absence of dispersal, its per capita growth rate is negative. You agree? Because this is the inferior competitor that's being excluded by the superior competitor. So do you agree? This is the R star rule, right? So it cannot persist on its own without dispersal, right? So then basically that term is negative because the inferior competitor cannot maintain a positive growth rate when rare in the absence of dispersal. Okay. So then, here's where I want you to pay attention. Since that quantity is negative, the sum of the initial growth rates is negative, right? So pay attention here, because this really, like, there's negative positive stuff here. So if that thing is negative, what can you say about 2 times that? It's still negative, and the product is positive, right? You multiply a negative quantity by a negative quantity, it's positive. So what does that say? Is that criterion ever going to be satisfied? What happens when you subtract a negative quantity from a positive quantity? It becomes a positive quantity. So that thing is always positive. Do you see minus minus is plus plus? Remember that from, I don't know, grade school? Like, isn't that the weirdest thing when they're young, they teach you? My daughter, I remember, like, what on earth is that? You explain that to me. I'm like, I don't know, I was told that and I was told to learn that. So you have to now not get tripped up here, okay? We are going to face a lot of these things from now for the next bit. But you agree, does everybody agree? Forget about the competition dispersal. If you subtract a negative quantity from a positive quantity, it becomes overall a positive quantity. Okay, so does that mean, since that happens here, that is never satisfied? So we proved our hypothesis, right? That in a spatially homogeneous environment. Why? Because we already knew this. Because the strength of density dependence is the same everywhere, right? It's going extinct everywhere. So that's the really interesting thing. Because it's going extinct everywhere, there's no point in sending individuals. You're in a dying population anyway, right? So there's the other species is a source everywhere. So there's no way the inferior competitor can persist here. Okay. So now let's look at the real interesting thing, which is local coexistence in a spatially heterogeneous environment. So now there's spatial variation in the per capita growth rate, which means in one patch, each species, so the inferior competitor has a negative per capita growth rate in the absence of dispersal in one patch, but a positive growth rate in the other one, right? Because now there is heterogeneity. What does that mean for the product of the initial growth rates? Now it's always negative because you're multiplying a positive number by a negative number, okay? Does everybody agree with that? So the minute it becomes heterogeneous, that first thing is going, the first part, the product is going to become negative. Now we have to deal with what happens when you subtract negative or positive from a negative, okay? So now what's interesting is, so that's negative. Now we just know that then invisibility must depend on the sign, the sum of the initial growth rates. This is what's really beautiful about it. See now, in a heterogeneous environment, the product does not matter actually, right? It drops out because that's always negative. Now we have to work out, is this quantity sufficiently negative to make this entire thing? That's really the beauty of it. So now we have to work out what's this interaction between dispersal and competition such that this thing can become negative. So we are going to look at 2 cases. The first one is very strong spatial variation in competitive ability. So what this means is that the positive initial growth rate in the favorable locality is really high relative to the negative growth rate in the unfavorable locality. So what does that mean? That means that where you do well, you do really, really well, okay? Where you do badly, but the good is so much greater, like the good patch is so much better than the bad patch. So then the sum of the initial growth rates can be positive, right? Because one is really much bigger than the other. So positive plus a negative, but the negative is smaller in magnitude than the positive. So then that term is now positive. Okay, so you have a negative. Now we are going to subtract a positive term from a negative term. What do you get? Minus plus is plus minus. So it's negative, right? So if you're very strong, see, if this very, but isn't it like, okay, so it's a little bit hard on like your basic 3rd grade algebra or whatever it is. But it's telling you something really significant in this very simple model. It means that if you have very strongly spatially heterogeneous competitive environment, meaning where you do well, you do really, really well. Where you do badly, relative to where you do badly, you can do as badly as you can possibly manage to be in the bad patch, but where you do well, you do really well. Now, this is the same idea in time. This is like what people say, good years and bad years, right? And then on average, you're going to come out better off. It's the same thing. So then you can actually invade all of the, you know. So the important thing is the magnitude of beta y doesn't matter, right? It could be very small, it could be very big. This is always negative. So that's the most important thing about this, is that when spatial heterogeneity in competitive ability is strong, invasion is possible under any level of dispersal. Doesn't matter how high it is or how low it is, because the spatial heterogeneity is very strong. Remember, we are talking about the interplay between spatial heterogeneity and dispersal. Here, spatial heterogeneity is so strong, dispersal simply is a means of connecting them. Okay? So as long as there's some dispersal, you actually get local coexistence. Remember, this is this magical thing that you can't get in the absence of dispersal and heterogeneity. And in this particular model, remember we were talking about feasibility and stability. There are certain kinds of models where the feasibility, the mutual invasibility actually is also the stability criterion. And this happens to be one of those. So when the coexistence equilibrium exists, it is stable. So we don't, that means that this situation actually is stable long-term coexistence. If you can show that the inferior competitor can invade when rare, why is there mutual invasibility? Because the superior competitor can invade anyway, right? So it's actually, sorry, no, that's not true. There is mutual invasibility because you can switch them. So either species 1 is the superior competitor or species 2 is the superior competitor. It doesn't matter. It's really who's superior and who's inferior. So you do get mutual, if you switch them, you get exactly the same result. You agree? Because it's about who's, there are only 2 species, right? There can only be 2 things. One is superior and one is inferior, because in a regular local patch, you cannot be both coexisting. There's the R-star rule, so only one can persist, okay? So that's a nice property of this model. It's a property generally of most Latka-Volterra competition models, that the mutual invasibility actually guarantees stability. That's not true of the model we looked at yesterday, when you have a dynamical resource and oscillations and all that, okay? Right, now let's look at weak spatial variation. Now is this, yeah.
Just to make things like wrap up in my head, the alpha is the growth rate.
Sorry, the competition coefficient.
Alpha?
Yeah, the scaled competition. Little I is the growth rate. So this is, remember, it's just competition and dispersals. So alpha is competition, beta is dispersal.
Oh, okay. It makes more sense that way. Okay, thank you.
So the row, all of that drops out actually. That's really interesting. You know, if you have studied the Latka-Volterra model itself, right? If you look at coexistence criteria, little r's actually drop out. They're not important. It's a k that matters. Because the little is the intrinsic growth rate is what you're maximally capable of producing. That doesn't actually matter when you are at the level of, because that almost goes to 0 when there's very strong density dependence, right? The per capita growth rate. So all the rows and everything else fell off when you calculate the invasion criterion. So this is alpha. Remember, alpha is competition, strength of competition, beta is the strength of dispersal, okay? But here, now look at this term in that I've highlighted in yellow. If the positive growth rate in the favorable locality is small in magnitude relative to the negative growth rate in the unfavorable locality, the sum of the initial growth rates can be negative. Now that's negative and this is negative. Now invasibility depends on the relative magnitudes of competition and dispersal, because now beta will determine whether this can be negative, right? that thing is really large, if beta is really large, what's going to happen? This negative quantity will become very large, then it's a plus plus, and this will never be, we can already anticipate this, right? So that's negative, this is negative. If this is larger than that, this will become positive. So beta, but it will become, could be larger if beta is large, right? Because otherwise it's the same thing, product versus sum. So we now have to look at this situation where now dispersal, magnitude of dispersal starts to matter. Remember before it didn't matter because there was very strong, here's the interaction between variability and dispersal. When variability, spatial variation is in competitive ability is very strong, all you need is some level of dispersal. But when it's weak, which is also true in reality, then how much dispersal occurs matters a lot. Okay? So this is a graph, this is an inversion plot where on the x-axis is the spatial variation in the strength of competition, y-axis is, so alpha, and the y-axis is the per capita scaled emigration rate, beta. Now on this x-axis, higher values means spatial variation is very high, meaning when you do well, you do very, very well. Okay? When it's low, it's like our current case. Now you can see there is an inversion boundary, right? So if you have high spatial variation, you're here. If you have low spatial variation, you're there. And you can see that there's an inversion boundary that separates local coexistence and regional exclusion. Meaning, either you coexist everywhere or you go extinct from the entire landscape, where before in the absence of dispersal, you at least got to persist in some place, right? Why does this happen? You can see that when spatial variation is strong, coexistence, this boundary doesn't cross, right? The boundary is over to that side. You can get local coexistence no matter what beta is, right? You see that boundary going like that, right? But when spatial variation is low, local coexistence possible only if beta is below a critical threshold. Above it, the species goes extinct from everywhere. Why? Fairly obvious, right? In this situation, the differences are not very large between the two patches, right? Your source is not that much better than your sink. If you send a lot of individuals out of your source, you're going to now reduce, like for example, remember beta is the ratio of the emigration rate to the growth rate. If that's large, so if emigration is large relative to local reproduction, it's detrimental to send out individuals, and dispersal here is random, so that's why there's no calibration of how many individuals are being, and in fact in real life, most individuals tend to disperse randomly, fairly randomly. So what happens is high dispersal can eliminate competitive differences and homogenize the local community dynamics across the meta community. Now, that's a result that's also very well known in population genetics. Too much gene flow can counteract local adaptation, which is exactly what we have sort of, the analogies. You have local coexistence, right? So when you have local adaptation but a lot of gene flow, lots of different kinds of genes come in and homogenize the system so that all the genes are everywhere. So there's no longer any local adaptation. This is exactly the same ecological equivalent. What is dispersal? That's the dispersal of individuals. In fact, gene flow is the dispersal of individuals, right? The genes don't go on their own. They don't enter minivan and go on their own. They go in the bodies of the individuals. But here we are not asking about the genetic consequences. We are asking about the ecological consequences. But the nice way to connect this is if you can maintain sink populations like that, that species could eventually become locally adapted, right? And then they could actually coexist locally. So the ecological spatial dynamic here can facilitate evolution of local niche partitioning, okay? But we should really take a moment to appreciate this because it's actually a really important result that when there's not a lot of variation, movement can homogenize that variation across the landscape. And that's true for ecology, that's true for evolution, okay? Question?
So, just to summarize, when competition variability across the patches is weak, then the invisibility depends on the dispersion, which also has to be weak, right?
Below a certain threshold, exactly. So dispersal has to be below a critical threshold. Otherwise, you have to still have enough dispersal to get to the other place, but not too much. And the level of that in reality depends on how different. And that may have something to do with the underlying abiotic variation. So say the soil quality is really, really different from one place to the other. That enhances these, the differences in the density dependent feedback loops. But it may not be that different, in which case too much movement can homogenize the system. Now, there are, like in experiments, people have shown this with proteins, but the gene flow thing is real. You see this all the time. All these things where local adaptation is counteracted because individuals keep coming in carrying different genes. Yeah.
And just to be clear, invisibility here is the same invisibility as always.
Yes, always.
Except
it's
we are
always
doing
it in space.
And a species growing when
Yeah,
another
so
species
here,
is at equilibrium.
that's a good point. So lest we forget what we started out with, this is where we are asking the question, the superior competitor is everywhere at equilibrium with the resource, and the inferior competitor is nowhere but invading from initial small numbers into both patches.
Yes.
Okay? So that's why we have a Jacobian where it's 1, 1, 0, 0, and 0, 0 is the second species is absent everywhere. 1, 1 means 1 is 1 because we have carrying capacity, scaled by the carrying capacity, right? So species 1 is in both patches. Species 2 is trying to invade both patches at initially small numbers, which is a very hard task because you also have to build up enough densities to then start moving them, right? Oh, forget, no. So sorry, I take that back. Species, so we are asking that, but one of the habitats is better for the second species. Yeah, oh, that's crucial. So for the heterogeneity, we are starting at the invasibility is calculated when the superior competitor is in both patches. But one of those patches is actually more favorable to the inferior competitor, the one that's invading, right? Actually, we should not say superior, inferior in this case. We should just say species 1 and 2 because they are inferior somewhere and superior somewhere else, right? This is not like a black and white like the earlier cases. So what we are saying is species 1, let's say, is everywhere currently, but one patch is good for it, one patch is not so good for it, but nobody else is there, so it's persisting in both. Then we say now species 2, we introduce species 2 in small numbers. What happens is since one of the patches is actually good for it, it is going to grow there and actually become dominant, and the other one is struggling, might even go extinct, but then you're going to send immigrants, right? So that's how it works. That's the idea that you're sort of, this is what you might do in restoration, for example. It's a real problem, right? You would want to actually, and then you would actually want to not introduce too many individuals if they tend to be very mobile, because you keep going to the wrong place.
But then it feels to me like if the competition variability is weak on both patches, if dispersion, you said that dispersion also has to be weak for invasion to happen. But it feels like if dispersion is also really strong. Well,
then it will go extinct from the entire. See, so it has a place where that's favorable, right? It's favorable, but it's not that different. So you're not growing as much. So your local reproduction is not that high. So you can only afford to send a certain number of individuals per unit time without actually facing the danger of having a negative per capita growth rate in your favorable patch. That's why the amount of dispersal has to be small. Okay. You see? So you have to always think, if you're in a population, you have reproduction and you're sending some individuals out, and there's also mortality, right? If more individuals leave than there is local reproduction, then you immediately become a sink, because that's like having extra mortality, because essentially the emigration rate works like a mortality rate because it's a loss to that patch. The only way that it increases the persistence of the species on the large scale is if they go somewhere else and survive and reproduce. It's not even that you just kind of land on some patch, right? You have to adjust to those conditions and reproduce. So in real life, there's a bit of a time lag. So if you've simulated these things, you will initially see like, you know, there will be some transient and eventually they will start to take, okay? So that's how it's gonna work. Okay, other questions about that? So this is a lot more subtle and has more layers than the last case, because now we are looking, I mean, these are things people have been working for decades and decades, right? Like there's a lot of subtlety. I've tried to give you the, what I thought was like in a, I don't know, half an hour lecture or 75-minute lecture, the gist of it, okay? It will take some time to really digest it, but the important things to take away are, first of all, the environment has to be biotically heterogeneous, right? The strength of whatever abiotic environment, so variation there is, has to modify the strength of density and frequency dependent loops in these different patches. And second, if that variability is very high, then it doesn't matter, there's no cost to dispersal, in other words. There's no demographic cost to dispersal, but if it's low, then there is a demographic cost to dispersal. Just like gene flow homogenizes selection, like, you know, local adaptation. Now, there is something else that's really, really interesting. So what is this mechanism by which so, you know, we just say, okay, it came, it stayed, right? But we know that local population persistence requires some negative density dependent feedback, right? So what is actually the mechanism? So the mechanism, here's the thing to think about. So we know that competitive coexistence requires intraspecific competition to be stronger than interspecific competition. But we saw that competitive exclusion is the outcome in the absence of dispersal, right? So there is clearly not enough negative feedback to make this work for both species, right? So then, however, when we add dispersal, we see they can coexist. So dispersal must be doing something that increases intraspecific competition or the strength of intraspecific interactions relative to interspecific interactions. You agree? Because we could leave it at that, right? We could leave it at the last slide and go home and say, oh, dispersal does it. But there's actually something more to it. There was already density dependent, but it didn't allow coexistence. If there is that is absolutely axiomatic, that first thing. You cannot ever get coexistence if intraspecific interactions are stronger than interspecific interactions. So since that's axiomatic, then we have to work out, we can hypothesize there must be some kind of negative feedback in this dispersal process that allows that to happen. But dispersal is density independent, right? And it's random. So how could this happen? So they see this problem isn't done yet. This is what I said about you have to really keep digging until you get to the bottom of it. So here's the thing, and this is really a very interesting thing. Dispersal actually generates a negative density dependent effect that increases the strength of interspecific interactions relative to interspecific interactions, and this promotes coexistence. I'm just saying that. So let's look at it. So here, let's work through this. So here I have plotted the abundance of a given species versus its per capita growth rate, right? You remember this, right? That straight line. What is that? The per capita growth rate decreasing with density linearly. Does that remind you of something? What kind of growth is that? Logistic. We had logistic in. So in the absence of dispersal, that's the density dependence. And we know that didn't work in this system. But look, what is look at the per capita growth rate versus density when there's dispersal. It generates a nonlinear density dependence. So this is now how the per capita growth rate decreases with increasing abundance. And you see that that curve is nonlinear. So dispersal actually converts this linear density dependence into a nonlinear density dependence. And see, what's beautiful about that is with dispersal, the growth rate is higher at low abundances, lower at high abundances. What does that mean? It's easier to invade when rare, right? Your growth rate, per capita growth rate is higher now than it was. When you're rare, is there going to be any competition? Only from the other species, right? So if you have a higher, intrinsically a higher growth rate, you are able to, you have a better ability to increase when rare, right? Then, so look at the difference. It's down here, this thing is still going up over there, right? So you have a very, very high growth rate when you're rare, which helps you to increase in when you're rare. And then a much stronger density dependence when you're abundant, which means you're much better regulated at high densities. Stronger population regulation at high densities, greater ability to increase when rare at low densities. Yes?
Is this because when we have a connected landscape, the per capita growth rate of the species doesn't depend on the abundance inside the patch, but just the abundance on the overall landscape?
Yeah, so you always anticipate my next slide. We have to see whether, so okay, so here, so I just said this. So the higher growth rate at low abundance means that it enhances the ability of species to recover from low density. Even if you were depressed to low density, now you can bounce back much easier because you're much, much higher, meaning you have lots more births than deaths. That's what it means. Lower growth at, why? Because you also have individuals coming in now, right? You have like these reproductive individuals coming in. And the lower growth at low, meaning that it makes the coexistence equilibrium even more strongly stable at this higher, right? Now, the net result is you get stable coexistence species, stable in the mathematical sense of species that would otherwise be excluded. But here, now, let's work this out formally, mathematically. So these are our equations, right? Now, look at a species per capita growth rate. Actually, it's not necessarily rare, you can forget that. But look at species I, I's per capita growth rate. Per capita growth rate is when you divide the original equation by X. Look at that. Now, the nonlinearity comes because you have to divide by Xi because you have Xj, right? You have the individuals coming from the other patch, and that has to be divided by, because when you keep dividing this, all the X's disappear. But now there's a problem because you have the individuals of that species coming from the other side. Now you have a 1 over X, right? That's a nice additional nonlinearity. So now per capita growth rate is a nonlinearly decreasing function of this density, because isn't that amazing? You have just density independent dispersal, but it generates this negative density dependent effect akin to, similar to intraspecific competition. And that then generates negative density dependence over and above that due to intraspecific competition. Remember, what stabilizes is you have to have strong intraspecific competition relative to interspecific competition, right? In the absence of dispersal, you agree? But that wasn't enough because we saw that it got excluded, right? But now with dispersal, there's negative density dependence over and above that. That means now there is a stronger intraspecific effect relative to the interspecific effect. Mathematically, it's because you have a 1 over X. Biologically, it means that individuals coming in like that can actually strengthen local negative feedback. Okay? So that's, one second. So you know, when I first said variability simply means that there are density dependent, the strength of density dependence changes from place to place. But now we see that when you add dispersal, you have an additional stronger intraspecific density dependence. So it's a pretty marvelous thing, I would say, right? Like being able to work that out from just a locomotor model and adding a couple of terms. So you had a question. And I'm sure he's going to anticipate my next slide. No, I'm joking.
So I'm trying to process this, thinking about the landscape scale, and if we were trying to add a new species that just isn't there.
Yeah.
If we are adding a species that has no population in any patch, then xj is also going to be very small.
Right.
And the contribution from the immigration is not going to be so big.
From the
patch.
dispersal would not be so big. But so I think if you're introducing, so say in real life,
Yeah.
you'll be introducing a species that I had either been there before and you know can colonize and thrive, right? If you're doing something restoration, you would be introducing something that's never been there, unless it's like a an invasive in the true sense species. So you would presumably, if you did an experiment like that, you would be maybe introducing a species that has now locally gone extinct. And in that case, it is guaranteed to have something favorable somewhere. And in which case, right? So because remember now the environment is heterogeneous. So that would work. If you just got something out of the blue from somewhere else and introduced, of course, it would just go extinct probably because it's rare, it's not the right place. Actually, it might just go extinct because the habitat is kind of wrong. The soil is wrong, right? Because, like plants, for example, have all kinds of nutritional requirements. But see, like this actually really matters for restoration. See, so for restoration, if you want to actually make sure that the species can persist, first of all, you should maybe choose, your location should be where there's a lot of, say, heterogeneity in soil or rainfall or something. The second thing is that you, if you do translocation or something, you don't exchange too many individuals, right? And if you're doing that, like translocation, then you control how many individuals are going, not the individuals themselves. But with like other species where you exchange pollen or they fly back and forth, then you have no control. And then if you're doing restoration, you really have to make sure the heterogeneity is sufficient. But that's something you can measure. I mean, you can measure the variance in rainfall. You can measure people do this all the time. Okay? Right. So just to summarize, so we've looked at the interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation, using exploitative competition as an example. And our model has these three features. You have local dynamics in terms of competition, spatial variation in competitive ability, and dispersal that generates negative density dependence in the per capita growth rate. Now, you do get competitive coexistence through the interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation, where local dynamics and the interplay between, so local dynamics in the face of dispersal can increase the strength of intraspecific density dependence relative to interspecific competition. And what's really important here is that there's local coexistence occurs via a spatial mechanism that actually it self-generates negative feedback. In this case, but that's dispersal, which is a biotic process. So we are still talking about it's a biotically, so here, the fact that there's the spatial mechanism involves dispersal means that because a biotic mechanism then introduces additional negative feedback. The reason I'm saying that is, remember I said that abiotic environment cannot generate negative feedback or positive feedback, but it's not an abiotic environment that's generating it. It's the movement of individuals, so that's a biotic factor. But it's not a species interaction as such, so you have a different biotic factor that generates negative feedback. Yes?
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding everything. Could you go back to the slide?
This?
Yes. Is this a general rule, or is it only for highly competition?
No, it works for everything. Any system. You mean like any species interaction, or?
Yeah, because I'm having a hard time, like I'm trying to think of the two patches and then the species in these two patches and how the species interact within each other, within patches and between patches. And this to me feels like it would only work in cases where there is high competition variability. On one of the patches, one of the species is really advantageous, and on the other patch, the other species is really advantageous.
Not necessarily. So you could even have it be less strong, but it will always be non-linear. So the degree of, that's a good point. The degree of non-linearity could be different. It may not be this high, but it will always enhance density dependence. And so people do this, and it's kind of I don't personally like this, but people would just take a model. So you say dx1 dt is some fx1, this is competition, okay, x1, x2, x1, and then you just say plus I, and you have some individuals coming in. It's a way actually to stabilize the system. People just do that instead of having a complicated density dependence term because of this universal mathematical thing that something independent, a constant actually works. So that's the people call that the mainland island model. Because the mainland is so big, some individuals leaving is not a function of the mainland's population. So the very simple precursor to this would be a model like that, and it still works, right? Because so the only reason we don't have an equation for the mainland is so big, it doesn't matter that a few individuals move, and that's island biogeography for you. So, but that itself, and some people like Peter Abrams would do this for like oscillatory systems to keep it from blowing up. So it works because of the mathematics of it, that you just get a 1 over x. Like, that's the thing. So, but what you make is a good point. Like, so, however, it will still allow coexistence in the two systems, the thing, but I think what might be different is that the relative abundances may be like this, the species where it's inferior might be very, very small, as opposed to being comparable or something. But that's actually it's a very good thing to investigate. Like, it's something that to ask that this graph may look different if the spatial variation isn't very large, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so you could basically draw a lot of curves like that, right? And I can't remember what this is, but I don't think it was very, very high in this particular curve. But the fact is, you have a 1 over x, that thing goes to infinity like that, because, x could go to 0 and the whole thing. When x is smaller, then this becomes, that's why that curve goes like. So that's a bit unrealistic. But we know that, at some point, you would actually hit the axis.
Because I'm not sure if I'm thinking it right, but for me, like, I think of a patch where species 1 is the one that has the advantage, and I try to introduce species 2. Perhaps eventually the species 2 will go extinct, but it doesn't, because there's another patch where species 2 has the advantage.
That's exactly what it is. So it keeps coming in all the time.
Yes,
so this wouldn't work if you didn't have dispersal. So that's the thing. Yeah. But the thing is, once there is dispersal, that local coexistence becomes a stable equilibrium.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's it. Yeah, so if you take away dispersal, this goes back to square one, right? But it's not just that you have a thing coming in and it's a transient thing, like, it's coming in and there's no like interior equilibrium, but this actually generates a stable coexistence equilibrium, and that equilibrium is stable to perturbations. So as long as there's dispersal mediated local coexistence. Okay, so that's absolutely right. That of course it's working because you're having movement, but the thing is, it's not just that movement allows individuals to be there, because they could just be hanging in there and always be going extinct. But now with this dispersal, they actually increase when they are rare and approach some interior equilibrium. Okay, so it's like this. So let's say x1, x2. let's say that, maybe that wasn't the right thing to draw. Well, just let's say that, okay, so x2 is where you're doing really well, and x1, you know, you just always like here, right? You're not really increasing or decreasing, you're just being maintained. Every step something is coming. Actually, that's not, once this happens, what happens is you actually go somewhere and you have this equilibrium, and that's stable now. Within, you know, as long as dispersal is present, you actually have an equilibrium that, like, say, couldn't be struck down by lightning or something. Something else wouldn't cause it to disappear. Okay, a perturbation, say like, I don't know, you know, there's a fire or something, right? So that's the most important thing. Okay, so now I had the fact, but for the problem with the subway, I was actually going to cover the rest of it, but apparently I'm not going to be able to. What should we do? You're tired, you want to go to lunch. Is that right? Yeah. Let's see a show of hands. I'm joking. Yeah, let's, so I was going to do mutualistic interactions. We will have to do it next tomorrow, which means that I'm only going to do 3 topics. Well, that's okay, right? Okay, let's stop. And I'm really sorry, it was completely beyond my control, and I understood enough of hand gestures to know that the station was closed. But then I'm like, what in the world am I to do now? And luckily I found 2 students from University of Sao Paulo who spoke English and said they were going to walk to the next station. And I decided, given the time, I was just going to go out of the station and get an Uber. So anyway, not my fault. Maybe tomorrow I should like come so early in case. Because yesterday I'd come so early, I'm like, oh, I'm good at this now. I'll come at 9:30. But anyway. Yeah, you know, I was actually thinking nobody had, this is my 3rd time coming, nobody had told me what to do if the train didn't run or the subway stopped, right? So I was like, ooh, interesting. I do not speak the language. And I desperately like trying to look for someone, do you speak English? Do you speak English? So actually the moral of the story is I need to start learning Portuguese.